Welcome, welcome, folks. It is Tuesday evening, July the 8th. Here we are deep into our second week now, or third week, I should say, of Hurricane Hub Live. And since we love acronyms so much in the weather community, this is HHL, and today is a very special day in Hurricane Hub Live history. We've got our first guest joining us today, and I can think of nobody better than to bring on to a show to talk about hurricanes than somebody that I spent a lot of time with. He was a mentor. I worked with him closely in Houston in my time there, and he is the one and only Chief Meteorologist David Paul from our sister station KHOU in Houston. David, always a pleasure. How you doing tonight?
You didn't tell me I was the first guest ever.
You sure are.
Oh, man, what an honor. The pressure's on.
Yeah.
That's great. How am I? I'm exhausted, as always. Houston weather never lets up. It's been rain and thunder, and now, of course, what's happening in Texas with the flooding has our full attention. We're in the middle of hurricane season. We've already had 3 storms, and no secret that I'm here today because we wanted to talk about the anniversary of Beryl making landfall.
Yeah.
But one thing that I was reminded of today, so a year ago today, Beryl's making landfall, the B storm. We've already had the C storm this year, so we're ahead of schedule. But nothing like actually getting hit by a hurricane in 2024. And
David, I've got the track here from Beryl when it was rolling out of the main development region, which that in and of itself was very unusual for late June, right? So when you saw this developing, coming out of the main development region, which is the birthplace of all our long track hurricanes. What was going through your mind, being in Houston for so long, seeing so many storms? When did you start to get a little bit worried that it may come towards Houston?
Oh, when the Hurricane Center models, when the HWRF and HMON started to indicate that this could go under rapid intensification. I don't know if you remember or not, but the global models at that time did not develop that Beryl into a Cat 5 in the Caribbean, which it ended up doing. But the Hurricane Center models, the more high-res models, were all just blowing this thing up into a Cat 5 in the Eastern Caribbean. And I remember looking at my colleagues in the weather office and just kind of going, what are we looking at here? Is this really going to become a Category 5 at the end of June, early July? And it ended up that the high-res models coming out of the Hurricane Center, HWRF and HAVS was one in particular. I don't know if you are familiar with the HAVS model, but HAVS performed particularly well. It's a high-resolution model, and so it ended up being the high-res models that nailed the intensity forecast and ended up being correct and developing that into a Cat 5. You never like to see storms develop that strong, that far out, because they have so much time over open water to strengthen and re-strengthen. And Beryl, it's got to run the gauntlet through the Caribbean. Is it going to bump into the western tip of Cuba? Is it going to make it past the Yucatan Peninsula? Is it going to shoot the Yucatan Channel and get into the Gulf unscathed? And luckily for us, after becoming that Cat 5, it did hit the Yucatan Peninsula, and it did weaken as it re-entered the Gulf of Mexico, which was a godsend for us.
Now, David, like that time of the year, the Caribbean usually becomes like the graveyard of tropical systems, right? We've got the increased shear usually from an active Eastern Pacific. Were you worried that it was going to just avoid any wind shear, which it obviously did, but were you hoping that that was going to just knock it down and not make it an issue as you got closer, to the 4th of July weekend, which pretty much, you were tracking it all through?
I think there were a couple of things. That time of year, usually climatologically, storms don't develop in that part of the Caribbean. There are several things that can interrupt the circulation development. You've got sometimes you got kind of a sea breeze coming off of Venezuela that will kick apart storms coming across the Caribbean. You've got very strong trade winds at that time, which usually helps sometimes have the surface circulation outrun the convection and they never get going. So to see it blow up into a Cat 4, Cat 5 was obviously very concerning. I mean, honestly, it turns my stomach. I get very worried. So that had me worried. And the other thing that had us scratching our head is, where is this thing going to end up? I don't know if you remember, but we had several models that would eventually take the system across the Yucatan and bury it into Mexico near Tampico. But then there were a couple, I believe it was the European, and also I think it was just the European, that was very consistent in wanting to turn it up the Texas coast toward Houston, which is what the storm inevitably ended up doing. So what was I thinking? I mean, honestly, Tim, I want them all to go away. I want them to just go away. And I can't make them do that. So in lieu of that, we prepared like heck. And, I think people here were very well prepared for the storm. But what we learned is, and we're reminded of, is that having your electricity infrastructure above ground, as we do here in Houston and Southeast Texas, you're very vulnerable to windstorms.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit now about, once the storm arrived, it was a high-end Cat 1 at landfall, right, just to the southeast of Houston. What was the damage like? How did the forecast play out rainfall-wise and, the corridor of the strongest winds? How did everything work out with Houston?
Everything kept shifting up the coast, up the coast, up the coast. And it really, honestly, Tim, it wasn't until probably about 8 to 10 hours out that we truly realized that we were going to take the core wind field from Beryl. However, that being said, we had been watching it for 2 weeks, so I don't think there was anybody in Southeast Texas that wasn't aware that the storm was coming. But you can't make it stop. And something interesting had happened earlier in the season. First of all, we had had a very wet spring. And in May 16th of that year, we had had a derecho come through.
Oh, yes, I do remember this.
So people were already on edge weather-wise and were paying attention. So what the derecho, we had winds with the derecho that peaked over 100 miles an hour across the immediate Houston area, stronger winds than we had with Beryl.
That's what blew out the windows and all those skyscrapers, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And not only that, but the ground was wet, so the trees didn't snap. They literally were uprooted. The roots came out of the ground. So you had thousands of not snapped limbs, but trees that were just bent over and the root ball up out of the ground because the soil it was in was so wet and saturated that there just wasn't much to hold on to. So and that derecho knocked power out to 1 million plus people. And it was hot and people were not happy about that. And we had power out for a couple of weeks in many places because of the derecho in May. So then when Beryl comes, July 8th, and we've got 3 million new people now out with power, it was a lot. It was very stressful. And our electric providers took a lot of heat for not being able to get the power back on as quickly as people wanted. In looking at it, I think there are two sides to that coin. I think our power providers did a great job in getting it on as fast as they could. But as I mentioned earlier, our power lines are all above ground. And so when you get a windstorm and you get trees coming down, you're just going to have a tremendous amount of power outages, and it's going to go on for a while.
Now, would you say there were any lessons learned from the forecasting of Beryl and watching it kind of just cruise through the Caribbean and that part of the season so early on for seasons to come that you can use?
There was one big lesson that I try to preach whenever I speak to groups or we have a forecast cone. And that is that it was about 48 hours out. Houston was in the right edge of the cone, just the edge of the cone. We weren't in the center of the cone. We were way off on the right edge of the cone, but we were in the cone. Well, just human nature. If you're not in the center of the cone, people tend to want to let their guard down. Maybe it's not coming here. It's going to go further down the coast where the center of the cone is. Well, what we all have to remember is that cone is an area of probability. 66% of the time, the storm stays in the cone. And everybody in that cone has the same exact chance of taking the center, pass over where they live. 66% chance it'll pass on the right-hand side of the cone. 66% chance it'll pass on the left-hand side of the cone. You have to ignore the center, which is just difficult for humans to do. We naturally look for the center in the middle of things. We're looking for symmetry. And so it can tend to let your guard down, and it can give you hope if you want the storm to go away. But we have to just remember, anywhere in the cone has the same chance of having a landfall, and you can't discount it even if you're on the edge, the outer edge of that forecast cone.
Now, being in the forecasting community, being in the Houston area, doing TV weather for so long, David, how would Beryl rank, you think, in terms of memorability or amount of damage that just in your mind, where does it live?
You know, it's interesting. It was a Cat 1, a moderate Cat 1, winds 80 to 85. It was strengthening as it came inland. As hurricane landfalls go, it wasn't over the top. Hey, you remember? It was 21 when Nicholas came in, and,
yep,
right?
Mm-hmm.
Same type of situation, tropical storm, tropical storm, tropical storm. Right at the last moment or so, it became a Cat 1 hurricane.
Yeah.
You know, and it ended up doing more damage than we thought, especially in our southern counties. So this one was not too dissimilar. It was a stronger hurricane for sure. It did carry stronger winds further inland. Honestly, Tim, if you look at that storm by itself, it was just a Cat 1 hurricane. We have had much stronger storms.
Right.
However, because it came on the tail of the derecho we had a little bit more than a month earlier, it really magnified the impact to people who now, for a second time in a matter of a month and a half, had their power knocked out for days or weeks. And in Houston, like most places in the summertime, it can get very, very hot, and it got very hot. And we had so many Houstonians suffering just simply because the power was out. We didn't have air conditioning, especially the most vulnerable in our community, the old folks' homes. A lot of them don't have generators. The heat is more stressful on the very young and the elderly. So that community was really hit hard by the aftermath of simply just not having something as basic, you think, every day as having electricity. So one of the biggest lessons learned by those folks is that if you are a caregiver in any way, shape, or form, you need to have an alternative source of power, a generator. And that's what you see being installed as quickly as possible all over the place over the past 12 months.
Yeah, and I tell you what, it was very interesting, watching Beryl develop, and just the list of records. I'll read them off to you for this storm. Earliest Cat 5, because it developed into a Cat 5 on July the 1st. It beat out the previous one by 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Strongest July hurricane, 165 mile per hour winds. Earliest 150 mile per hour hurricane. It went through rapid intensification, a TD to a major in 42 hours. It was the easternmost major hurricane in June, and it was obviously an early developing main development region storm. But I'm glad that none of those records are like the amount of fatalities or the amount of storm damage monetarily across the area. So none of these really were with impacts, which was good.
Hey, but Tim, look, you're like me. Your community is sitting on the Atlantic coast. Yeah. I'm on the Gulf Coast. And you see these records that all occurred when this was, 1,000 miles away in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
At some point, that type of a storm is going to impact directly the Houston-Galveston area as a Cat 4 or, heaven forbid, a Cat 5, or on the Virginia coast.
Yeah.
It's that type of a storm that, the thought of it keeps me up at night. Eventually it will happen. I was looking at Houston and Galveston hurricane records. Houston, Galveston, Upper Texas coast, we haven't had a Cat 4 since 1947.
Ooh.
So it's been a while. And when that happens, really the bottom line is that the community will have to come together to help each other, because it is going to be a long haul recovery, no matter where you are, no matter what community you're in, to recover from such a storm. We've seen Florida take several storms in the past several years where they've had they're taking years to recover. And so those stats, strongest hurricane in July, earliest Cat 5, rapid intensification. Rapid intensification, Tim, that's another, scenario that I know keeps you and I up at night.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I want to get your take too. I'll ask you in just a second, but I want to ask you one more question. People that have lived in Houston, say for 10, 15, 20 years, what would you say is the benchmark storm that everybody, when they hear a hurricane, they're like, oh, I remember that one. That was the doozy. That's what I set the standard for.
In the last 20 years, it's going to be Ike in '08. '08.
Yep.
You have to go way back to '08. And what happens is, we're talking about human nature, and we automatically look for the center of things. We want to find the symmetry in it. The other part of human nature is that we just we have this thing called a normalcy bias. It's normal that we get maybe a Cat 1 or a Cat 2. Ike was a Cat 2 for the inland winds. Ike also had an 18-foot surge that wiped off the Bolivar Peninsula. But we get used to things being normal. And so another thing that concerns me is that when we actually are forecasting a real major hurricane to come in, that it will be difficult, even for myself, to get my head around the fact that, wow, are we going to really have 140-mile-an-hour winds in here? What is that going to look like? So to answer your question, Ike in '08 is the benchmark. And folks on the coast remember that because of the surge that just utterly obliterated the Bolivar Peninsula, which is another one of our barrier islands. But inland, it was only a Cat 2, so we had a lot of roof damage. The storm moved through without too much flooding. And so this is another thing. Our benchmark going back to '08 is a hurricane that on the scale isn't that heavy.
Yeah. And you could also probably say that same thing with Harvey, right? I mean, obviously it was catastrophic flooding, but it was a lower grade system.
Well, with Harvey, that's an interesting one. You ask Houstonians, and they'll tell you they went through Hurricane Harvey, but the problem is we didn't go through Hurricane Harvey.
Yep.
We had the rain from Hurricane Harvey. Harvey hit a couple hundred miles to the south down the coast as a Cat 3 or 4, but it sat down there, which put us on the wet side. So yes, devastating flooding, off the charts flooding, but we didn't go through the hurricane part of Harvey. I think our strongest wind gust was 35 miles an hour with Harvey. So, they're all so different and unique. You just can't put them in a box. And that's another thing that we want to do as humans, just living our normal lives. We want to, it's going to be like that last storm.
Always comparing it, yeah.
It won't be. It'll be something totally different.
Yeah. So that brings me to my final question, David. How do you see, based on how this season has already played out, 3 named storms, the C-named storm coming in about a month ahead of climatological norms, how do you see this season, playing out? All the outlooks are calling for, again, above normal activity. But being along the Gulf Coast, for most of your career and seeing all these seasons play out, what's your professional take on how you think the season may play out?
Sure, absolutely. One day at a time. One day at a time. Yeah. So I grew up in Houston. I know this place like the back of my hand. I've seen, the last Cat 3, the last major we had was 1983. I was in high school. That was a night. I'll tell you what, that was a night. That was the A storm in August as well. And I think that was the only hurricane to hit that season, hit mainland U.S. was Alicia in 1983. But to get back to your question, so honestly, looking at it, what do I expect? I expect the season is probably going to get busy around August 15th. We will have, we'll end up with somewhere between 13 and 18 named storms as they forecast, which is within pretty much a standard season. But, where they're going to form and where they're going to go, we have no idea.
Right. So
what I have learned in all my years is that I just take it one day at a time. And really, when we get into August and September, it's twice a day. It's twice a day at a time, once in the morning, once in the evening, because you don't want to go to bed or wake up with a surprise on your doorstep, which absolutely can happen.
Speaking of that, I remember you telling me a story when you were early on in your career. Wasn't there a storm that you had went to sleep? You were doing the morning show, right? And then you woke up and there was a hurricane.
Yeah.
Right? That is an amazing story.
That was Francis. That was Francis. I believe it was Francis. Yes, what year was that? Man, 03, 04? Yeah, I was the morning meteorologist at that point.
Yeah.
In fact, our chief was Dr. Neil Frank, director of the Hurricane Center, who had come to us. And after he did the 10 o'clock news, I want to say it had just become a tropical storm. And he went home, and I came in the morning, and I came into a Cat 1 hurricane making landfall in the Bolivar Peninsula.
What a way
Yeah.
to start the day, huh? Jeez.
I mean, just the idea that can happen is so. And I remember watching the other stations and kind of happy to see that they were just as surprised as I was that we are all waking up to a Category 1 hurricane hitting on the Bolivar Peninsula. Yeah, it was that was a shock. It's not unlike we had another one. It was Tropical Storm Allison, which was '01, totally unforecast, became a tropical storm in a matter of about 8 hours off the coast and came inland. And then that's the one that curled back on us and gave us this tremendous flood. It was the worst flood we'll ever have until Harvey came along and made that the worst flood that we'll ever have. But to your point, you can go to sleep with a tropical disturbance sitting off your coast, and you can wake up with a strengthening tropical storm or hurricane the next morning. In fact, that storm I mentioned when I was a teenager, Alicia, that was one that underwent rapid intensification in the northwest Gulf of Mexico, and overnight went from tropical storm to Cat 3, and then came inland early one morning.
And then it seems like there's just so many more instances now of rapid intensification that it happens all the time now. You know, we can have a tropical storm and 12 hours later have a Cat 2 or Cat 3. It's wild.
What do you think about that?
I think it's fascinating. Just the amount of heat energy that's available in the oceans that these storms are absolutely just plugging into. And it's almost like there's just an endless source.
Yeah.
And it's always as they're approaching landfall, too. You know, even with Chantal here, you know, it wasn't a case of rapid intensification, but it did overperform the intensity forecast, only a little bit, but it did. And it was just because it was sitting over the Gulf Stream, which it was just replenishing the warm water, and it was taking advantage of it, even though the atmospheric conditions were marginal. Still had a bona fide, you know, tropical storm, and we had catastrophic flooding in portions of central North Carolina. So it's amazing what it can do with just even a short amount of time over that open water.
Yeah. You know, I was actually talking with Pat Kavlin. You know Pat. We were talking about rapid intensification recently, and he was pointing out that quite often you'll get a storm that's gaining latitude and approaching the northern Gulf Coast or the Virginias, Carolinas, and up the East Coast. And as it's gaining latitude, it will just begin to feel a trough in the upper levels to the north. Mm-hmm. And if it's moving over warm water at the same time, the Gulf Stream or the loop current in the Gulf of Mexico, the combination of just a little bit of extra outflow at the top, and then moving over that warm Gulf Stream, and you know, maybe models don't pick up on the subtleties taking place right there, and you get this rapid intensification under those conditions. So he thinks it has a lot to do with a storm that's gaining latitude.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Just beginning to feel that top. I tend to look at it more of if I see that perfect outflow with a high pressure dome sitting right over the top of the storm, you know, that's what I'm looking for. Under that scenario, you can also get that exhaust in all four quadrants, and boom, you'll get
explosive.
You know,
Explosive. Wow. I mean, great conversation, David. I really appreciate you spending time and talking about Beryl. Maybe we'll have you back on and talk about Harvey when we get into August.
Oh, you got it. It's a deal. Hey, Tim, so good to see you and spend some time with you this evening. For those of you that didn't catch the beginning, Tim and I have worked together before, and I miss working with you every day. You're a great meteorologist. You are a great and a fantastic educator on tropical meteorology, and I really appreciate you.
Well, thanks, Dave. I learned a lot from you, my friend. You're a great mentor. Appreciate you.
All right, man.
All right, have a good night.
You too, Tim.
All right, folks, let's get into today's tropical discussion. We've got nothing going on out there, which is great news. It's very, very quiet in the Atlantic Basin. I want to start off, though, with our trivia question from yesterday. I asked you all, what quadrant of a hurricane can you find the strongest of the winds? Is it going to be the right front, the left front, right rear, or left rear? Well, the answer is the right front quadrant. And when we look at all four quadrants in a hurricane, it all has to do with the storm movement, the direction in which it's traveling. The front right quadrant is always going to have the strongest of the winds because you got to factor in that storm motion. Say a storm is moving along at 30 miles per hour. That's pretty fast movement. So let's say 20 miles per hour. You tack that on to the peak wind speeds, which you're going to find closer to the center there in the eye wall, and you're going to magically increase the peak winds by 20 miles per hour with that storm movement in whichever direction it's moving. So the right front quadrant is always going to be where you find the strongest of the winds. All right, here we are in the Atlantic hurricane season, July the 8th. Nowhere near the peak of hurricane season. We got a long way to go. But so far, as you hear David and I talking about, we had 3 named storms so far. We're ahead of schedule. When you look at climatology in general, typically we get our 3rd named storm in early August. We were almost a month ahead of schedule with that. Now, does that foretell an extremely active season? No, it doesn't, because there are seasons that we go month and a half without our first named storm at all, and then it turns into an active season. So an active early season doesn't really have anything to do with what the rest of the season may hold. The basin right now, very, very quiet. I will say it's probably not as quiet as it has been. The plumes of dust that have been coming off the coast of Africa and traveling due west are still numerous and very, very large, like this one in the central Atlantic. But they are starting to build latitude, and this happens as we head into July. Climatologically, these all start to move a little bit farther to the north, and that opens up a corridor of better atmospheric conditions. And these seedlings, these African easterly waves that start to get a little more robust this time of the year too, move into this fertile atmosphere and they start to develop. Here is one of those, an African easterly wave here, a seedling, if you will, about to exit the coast. Overall, it's pretty robust looking. Models don't do anything with this, though, but it just shows you that it's starting to get a little more active out in the main development region. Another cluster of convection here shows you that, and it's also setting up south of the dust, so there is convection firing in the main development region, and that's also probably just a piece of the intertropical convergence zone that's becoming detached and lifting to the north. And then north of the Bahamas here, another cluster of unorganized convection. So there is activity out there, just nothing that's forecast to become a developing storm. Now, the Climate Prediction Center puts out outlooks. Now, this one is week 2, and I'm going to show you week 3 as well. So this brand new just came out, and this does highlight for next week the possibility, low possibility, of some development in the northern Gulf. Models here are very, very subdued with anything developing here, but it's somewhere to look for possible development here, getting in that time frame in the next week, week and a half. Then we jump out to week 3, almost the end of July, and not forecasting any development. Now, this does change. It could change, certainly, but at least of right now, it looks like a pretty quiet middle to end of July. Here's our comparison scorecard of the basins, the Eastern Pacific and the Atlantic. The East Pac has had a blockbuster season so far. 3 hurricanes, 2 majors. The last 2 storms were major hurricanes, Eric and Flossie. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, we had 3 very weak tropical storms, 2 of which making landfall, Barry in Mexico, Chantal, of course, this past weekend in South Carolina, both causing a lot of flooding, but overall, in storm components, it was very weak overall in general with wind speed. All right, out in the Eastern Pacific now, very, very quiet. Crickets out there, which is a big change from the last month. We always had an active system out there, or an area of interest that we were watching to develop into the next named storm. Yeah, there's plenty of convection out here, but nothing looks to organize. There is no outlook for any storm development here within the next 7 days. Now, that opens up the possibility that we could see the Atlantic wake on up, because when we've got an active East Pac, the exhaust from storms creates wind shear in the Atlantic that generally suppresses storm development. When we don't have any activity there, that wind shear goes away, the dust lifting to the north. Overall, the sea surface temperatures are very, very warm. I'll show you here the anomalies. The yellows are anything that's above normal for this time of the year, blues being a little bit cooler than normal. We've got some sea surface scarring from the past storms in the Eastern Pacific that soaked up some of that heat energy from the ocean surface. And then in the Atlantic basin, completely untapped. Okay, we had a storm, Andrea, our first storm in the subtropics. We had Chantal here off the East Coast, which you can see a little bit of some scarring there. And then we had Barry in the Gulf and the Bay of Campeche moving into Mexico. So completely untapped in terms of available heat energy or tropical energy here that storms could use. You can even see some shades of orange in the subtropics and down towards the main development region where sea surface temperatures are more than suitable for tropical development. So we'll see what happens over the coming weeks. But as of right now, there's nothing forecast to develop there. So that's the good news. All right, let's get to tonight's tropical trivia. All All right, I want to ask you, what was the busiest hurricane season on record in the Atlantic Basin? Do you think it was 2005, the year of Katrina, 1997, 2020, not too long ago, or back in 2017, the season of Harvey that David and I were just talking about, or Maria, or Jose, all big storms and big seasons, all of these. Which one was the busiest, with the most number of named storms? We'll talk about it. I'll have the answer for you tomorrow on HHL. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. A great conversation with David Paul, chief meteorologist out at KHOU, my former colleague. Great mentor, great person, has a lot of weather knowledge in that head. So we'll talk to him again during the rest of the season. So I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday evening.